I'm Tripp Green.
And I'm Jarrett Swearingen.
And you're watching Set Talk with Millbrook Studios, where we ramble about whatever production-related thing we want to talk about.
And because these conversations are going to be so loose, feel free to comment down below. Let us know if there's any kind of topics you want us to cover, or if there's something that we cover in this video and you want us to readdress it in the next one. Comment down below and we will make sure to get to them.
So when you're thinking about lens sets for a project, what are sort of the first considerations do you think that you go to?
Well, definitely just depends on the project type. So if it's something where you're a run and gun, one-man band, you're going to want something that's a little bit more versatile than a full set of primes, for instance. But if you do have a support team around you and you can go with that better image quality that primes offer, that's something I would go for. So
yeah,
some things to consider: the type of project and if you're going to be a one-man band or not.
So we do a lot of all kinds of productions at Millbrook Studios, but especially in our early years, we were using a lot, we still do, a lot of a very simple lens. Probably one of our most used lenses is a 24-105 Canon L series lens. Now, this is not like a super expensive lens, as cinema lenses go, but it's such a workhorse. It has good image quality, not amazing, but good image quality, especially for the size and the weight. It also has a really good stabilizer in it, and it has autofocus and a really good focal range, so 24-105. Obviously, what you just saw is a big drawback. That telescoping, when you change focal length, is a major pain if you're trying to do like gimbal balancing and stuff like that. So you kind of have to tape it or something if you're going to use it. But this, if you're doing one-man band or very small set dock stuff, is a great option. You will need a faster camera because it's an f4. But if you're outdoors or you have a fast camera, love it.
For interviews and anything like that where you're focusing really strongly on a subject for a long period of time, something like a cine lens might be better to choose because you can open up that aperture all the way up to t1.3 and you still have a pretty sharp image even at t1.3 compared to some of the zooms that offer like a t or an f2.8 or 1.4.
Yeah, and even within the cine lens, you do have to be a little careful and do your own testing to see because different use cases. If you're going on mobile, that little loss of sharpness might not mean much, and different people have different sensitivities to it. But even cinema lenses, these lenses, and even within one family, your 85 and your 50 might be different. And so you'll have sometimes one lens that is like buttery soft when you open it up. And so you just kind of need to know where your personal cutoff is. It probably, on a lot of lenses, is not going to, unless you're on master primes or something, probably not going to be fully wide open. It's probably going to be a stop or so down from that. Although, it's perfectly usable. It's perfectly good if you need to use it. But just, you want to do some testing to make sure you do understand just how much sharpness you're losing when you go wide open. So, those are some practical considerations. There are other really niche things that I might be thinking about. Like if I know that we're going to be using a very lightweight gimbal, like maybe I, go have one of these little pancake guys in a bag somewhere just to make sure that thing can get balanced and all of that. I don't know, are there any other really specific use cases you might choose a certain lens for that you can think of?
Well, I was going to ask you, and we've talked about this in a previous video, but with this lens here that has this pretty unique softening filter.
Yeah, so I, back at the very beginning of my career, I was, and I still occasionally do it, but I was shooting actors' headshots, which is a great way for a young photographer to make some extra money and get really good at shooting portraiture. But I was using this lens as a 135. Portraiture focal lengths, I typically am looking for something 85 and over, and this was a really long one, and it was a not an expensive lens at the time. It's a Canon, I think it's actually called, soft focus 135. It's a 2.8 lens, so it's pretty quick, and it's a great lens if you're stopped down a little bit, and at 135, it doesn't, you don't have to be fully wide open to have it pretty shallow. But this is a really weird lens, and you can probably look up the effect, or maybe we can show a screen, and this thing will show you. Jarrett can, when he's editing, put something in here. But it has this little feature here, and it's like an internal softening filter, and it looks very, very radical 80s style mall glamour portrait. So I'm not really sure why they spent the money on R&D and time to make this incredibly niche in-lens effect, and why they thought there would be demand for that, but they did it. So yeah, I don't know, that's a weird one.
So a standard thing that people will come across is an interview. Is there any kind of standard lenses or lens lengths you like to stay between when you're shooting interviews?
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously a lot of that's going to be dictated by the space that it's available. So a lot of times when you're going in and you're having to shoot an interview, some corporate interview, like, you kind of have to take what you get, and we'll also always try and say, like, oh, wow, this room is kind of small. You got something larger slash cooler available? Not always the case. But I would say, you know, generally, and I mix it up a little bit, so it kind of depends. Like, some projects, there's like, you know, I'm sure you've seen nowadays people will do sort of like the Mr. Robot-y kind of stuff sometimes, where it's like a really wide angle lens and this sort of like unorthodox framing for at least one of the cameras. Or even like all of the cameras potentially. I've seen projects like that.
Yeah.
I would say usually though, you just want to be long enough and open enough that you have a nice, good separation and shallow enough depth of field that it looks cinematic to your client. And so generally I would say that looks like for your A cam. For me, I'm probably on like a 50. Sometimes I'll do an 85, which is like, will make it look like real compressed and shallow. That's not always necessarily the look I'm going for, but I would say just choosing something long enough. Again, it could be any focal length, because you could do that kind of weird, like close Mr. Robot-y kind of thing with it. But usually I'll have something like that, and then we'll have a B angle that's on usually like a 70 to 200 with a stabilizer on a Dana dolly. If there's space to operate that way. Yeah, that would be the typical 2-camera thing. Sometimes we'll have something like right off camera that's a longer punched in shot, but nowadays with 4K, like, you can probably crop in enough to make a third shot. Some projects will also use a little bit of a wider lens that's not necessarily quite as shallow. It's sort of like a BTS shot, right? Where you have somebody just like operating either on a gimbal or even handheld, where they're like grabbing shots through some stands, or where they're racking focus between the subject and the subject on the screen on the back of the camera and stuff like that. So it kind of depends, but I would just say, like, yeah, in general, I'm probably on like a 50 or so on the A cam, and then like a 70 to 200 on that side angle, unless there's some like really unique look I'm going for.
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about practical reasons for choosing certain lenses. For you, like, I don't know if you've like shot a bunch of different lens sets. Like, what are your considerations as far as like the look that you're getting out of a lens or a lens set when you're making a choice?
I think it depends on the project. So if it's something that is more corporate, or if it's going to be interview based, I typically go for something that's a little bit cleaner and has less character.
So what are like some lens sets you think would fall into that?
If you want to go with primes, the Zeiss CP2 or CP3s are really nice. If you want to go with zooms, there's either the DZO or Sigma zoom sets. I think the Sigma comes in an 18 to 35. I think it's a 2.8, so it's still relatively fast. If you're doing interviews, you can still get separation. Or you can go with the 50 to 100, I believe it is, Sigma. So that full set will cover a very nice range, and you only need to bring 2 lenses.
That one might be even longer. It might be like 150 or something like that, I think.
Yeah, very versatile. That and the DZO lenses. The only difference with the DZO and the Sigmas is that the DZOs are parfocal. So if you're doing any kind of snap zooms, crash zooms, you can do that with the DZOs without worrying about, pulling focus mid-zoom.
Yeah, I don't know if they've updated them, but the last I saw some testing from those Sigma, the lower end, the zoom Sigmas, was that there was like some pretty serious breathing on the longer of those 2 lenses. So just something to be aware of. And when we say breathing, if you don't know what we're talking about on a zoom, when you change focus, it'll actually shift the focal length slightly. And so if you're having to rack focus, you're gonna like, it's gonna breathe in and out. So just if you're having to do rack focus, it's just something to keep in mind with zooms, particularly like more affordable zooms.
So what you're getting with these more expensive prime lens sets compared to some of the more budget-oriented ones like the Rokinons, especially the early iterations of the Rokinon primes, is that you're not going to have matching characteristics even in the same family. So the 24 might be a little bit different than the 50, and we're not just talking about things like chromatic aberration. Sometimes it can be the contrast between the lenses. Some lenses will have less contrast.
Much less contrasty than this one, as an example.
Yeah. So things like that, like do your testing before you get out, because you don't want to find that one lens is just way more contrasty than the other, and then you have to do a little bit extra work in post. And then obviously, as you mentioned, the color characteristics are all things to be accounted for, but typically the more you pay, the better.
That is like nowadays definitely a part of the sort of high-end, hip, moody look that you see a lot in these high-end ads. And a lot of that is coming from either anamorphic lenses or very vintage lenses. I mean, that's very popular nowadays too. Like most of this is pretty newish glass. But there's a lot of high-end production that use vintage glass from the 80s or 70s or whenever, the old Super Speeds or something like that, and specifically because they're not perfect and clean like master primes or something like that. You just have to know, what you're getting into and how heavy it's going to be. But yeah, they can definitely sort of elevate the look a little bit and make it feel a little more organic, lived in, authentic.
What are some of those characteristics of the vintage lenses that you think people are drawn to?
Yeah, I mean, usually they're not gonna be as sharp, for one, and everybody wants everything to be super sharp. And if you're the kind of person who wants to do everything and fine tweak and pixel peep their look in post, fine. But honestly, like a lot of times, real optical effects are going to not only look better, in my opinion, but it's easier because it's already done for you, right?
Yep.
You don't have to do a bunch of rendering and a bunch of effects in post. So you'll have stuff like you'll have heavier vignetting a lot of times, just generally softer. You might have more halation, so like glow around light sources. You could have more chromatic aberration, which I think that's rarely something that you're trying to go for.
Yeah.
But maybe if you're going for a very vintage look, it's fine. And
then there's lenses like the Helios, like 44 millimeter, that has the swirly bokeh, which is just uncharacteristic of any other lens that I've used, and something that you probably wouldn't want to use unless for a very specific reason.
And consider too, I mean, like these lenses too, the way that they handle another big difference is going to be the way they handle flaring. So modern lenses are going to have a much more advanced lens coating, which allows them to retain contrast when they're being backlit and prevent heavy flaring. Of course, you watch a lot of these high-end shows or commercials and you see huge flaring. It's something they want. And so that's a reason you may be looking at vintage lenses, vintage Pancros or something like that, is because they do flare. You just have to be a little careful, because I think it's very rare that you have a window in the background and you want just like a contrast wash, just like a veiling flare. Like rarely are you gonna want that. And so it's tough for that. You have to be careful, but so the flaring is a big reason to do them. So do you prefer shooting primes or zooms?
I think I prefer primes. I always prioritize and put an emphasis on image quality, and then the ability to open the aperture up relatively pretty fast without losing quality. And so for some of those reasons, I think I would always go with a prime. But if it's just me and I have nobody else, shooting a zoom is almost mandatory. But the preference is for prime because of that better image quality. And then what about you?
Yeah, I guess I would say the same thing. I mean, honestly, I'm probably one of the only I'll get burned at the stake for this one, because I have been before. Probably the only DP will say this. Like if somebody made, I don't know why nobody has made this, and it's probably just a manufacturing or a physics limitation. But if somebody made like a camcorder style, like the old DVX 100 kind of deal, or HVX 200, for those of you ancient people out there who use some of those cameras. If I had like a body like that, but had a full frame sensor inside and had a lens that was, let's say, like, 15 or 18 to 105, or even better, like 150, but I'm sure that's difficult to do. But if you could get that at like a 2.0, awesome, maybe even a 2.8, I'd be like, I'll buy that camera all day long. I'll buy that camera all day long, because most of the projects that you're doing as a production company are probably going to be mid-range corporate projects, regional advertising. And then, if you get that huge Hardee's commercial or whatever, you go out and you rent your Cook Anamorph, your Master Prime, whatever because you're probably going to rent anyways when you get to that level. And so to me, it's always been like, well, I want to be able to swap your lenses. And everybody who's ever said that, like, but the specialty lenses. I'm like, okay, and how often, what lenses are you using? And they're like, well, we have one set. And I'm like, right. So you always are using the same lenses on every project anyways. So like, I was like, if I could
the same concept.
Yeah. So if I could just have it all built into one thing, or I just pull it right out of the case and point and shoot, like, I'd be like, hell yeah.
Well, if Canon's listening, maybe they can create something like that and put it out in the market. But I think it'd be difficult for people to steer away from the more traditional formats of being able to swap lenses, if anything, just to keep ACs in business.
Yeah, I think you have to be like honest with yourself, though, as like the level of production you're doing, because like it looks very cool in BTS, and it sounds very cool to use, and this is a small one, but to use some massive cinema primes, and then I'll see BTS where somebody's got like a Master Prime, an Alexa Mini, and like a Manfrotto 502 head or something, and I'm like, dude, that's gonna look terrible, because it's like all over the place.
Yeah.
So it's like, you don't. I guess I'm past in my career like trying to necessarily look cool to the other cinematographers on Instagram and my BTS photos. Like, I'm just trying to make sure that like we make our day, get our shots on time, quickly and easily, with the best look that fits the project that we can.